How's it going, everyone? Today we will be talking about the regulation of heart rate. So first, I will reintroduce the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk a little bit both about the parasympathetic and sympathetic branch, and then we will discuss how each nervous system is going to influence the rhythm of our heartbeat. Ultimately, we assess cardiac health and cardiac performance by looking at cardiac output, or the liters of blood per minute that is pumped out by the heart to the systemic circulation. And remember, the formula for cardiac output is heart rate, how many beats per minute, times stroke volume, how much blood is being ejected out per beat. And when you multiply these two, you get that liters of blood pumped out per minute. So now cardiac output is going to be influenced by changes in both heart rate and stroke volume. So we will see that heart rate is ultimately going to be influenced by the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Stroke volume is also influenced by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system and the autonomic tone. But ultimately, the reason why they influence stroke volume is because they influence myocardial contractility, or the strength of contraction for those cardiac myocytes. And so these are all the different intrinsic and extrinsic factors that sort of play a role in regulating cardiac output. Intrinsic factors are the ones related to the heart itself, such as sarcomere length or the frequency produced by the SA node. And extrinsic factors are more factors outside of the heart, such as the neural control or hormones. And so our body, the autonomic nervous system, is going to set an autonomic tone. And how I like to compare it is almost like a seesaw. So we don't have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic branch activated at the same time. Depending on what is going on, either it's going to be rest and digest, in which case the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, or it's going to be a moment of excitation, fight or flight, in which case then the sympathetic nervous system is more activated. And so these factors are ultimately going to impact heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. So first, let's start with the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the nervous system that is more activated when we are in periods of rest and digest. So throughout most of your day, this is the nervous system that is dominant and that regulates heartbeat when we are at rest. What we will see is when the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, we're going to have lower heart rates, lower cardiac outputs, and lower pressures. And the reason for this is because during rest and digest, there's not really a huge need to have high heart rates or high cardiac outputs or high blood pressures. And so when we're resting, there's just not that metabolic need to have all this blood being circulated and these high pressures. So the parasympathetic nervous system makes sure everything is operating just as it should be during those periods. It's important to keep in mind that the nervous system uses many different types of neurotransmitters and many different types of receptors to bring about certain actions throughout the body. And so when we say the parasympathetic nervous system, its main neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And the reason that we say that is because this is the neurotransmitter that's released by postganglionic neurons that are going to bring about actions within target cells, target organs, such as the heart. Acetylcholine is going to bind to what are called cholinergic receptors located throughout the body. And there are two main types. First, we have muscarinic receptors, which are G-protein coupled receptors that start secondary messenger signal transduction pathways within target cells that will lead to a certain action. And for example, these muscarinic receptors are located on our SA and AV nodes, our nodal cells. And when they become activated, when there is an increase in parasympathetic nervous activity and more acetylcholine binds to them, it's going to lead to a decrease in heart rate. Because it's going to slow down the rate of action potentials being sent from these nodal cells. And they are also located on certain endothelial and smooth muscle cells as well. And upon their activation, it will lead to vasodilation. But it's very important to note that parasympathetic nervous activity has very little to do with vessel radius or for most vessels, but there are specific vessels that do have these muscarinic receptors. And so when parasympathetic nervous activity does go up and these are activated, it will lead to vasodilation within those specific blood vessels. Acetylcholine also binds to nicotinic receptors, and it's important to remember that the autonomic nervous system is going to be composed of all these different receptors and neurotransmitters. And really, when we talk about neurophysiology, the action that gets brought about by a neurotransmitter and its receptor is really dependent on where that receptor is and what kind of receptor it is. And so acetylcholine is not only involved in parasympathetic activity, but it's also involved in things like the somatic nervous system. When acetylcholine binds to the second type of cholinergic receptors, nicotinic receptors, it causes an end plate potential at the skeletal muscle motor end plate. And you may remember from physiology that this is going to start the excitation contraction coupling process, which leads to skeletal muscle contraction. The autonomic neuron that is going to activate a certain cell of the body is called the postganglionic neuron. And we just talked about how parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine in order to influence those cells, while we'll see in a second, the sympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to release norepinephrine. But both of the postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system have nicotinic receptors on their dendrites. And when acetylcholine binds to those nicotinic receptors on those dendrites, what's going to happen is both types of neurons are going to be activated. And so today, the main focus of what we are talking about is the release of acetylcholine by postganglionic parasympathetic neurons, which are going to bind to muscarinic receptors on the nodal cells of the heart, and the output of that is ultimately a decreased heart rate. The sympathetic nervous system is also referred to as our fight or flight response. And this is the nervous system that is activated when we are undergoing physical activity. And so the neurotransmitter that's released by the postganglionic sympathetic neurons is either norepinephrine or epinephrine. These are also released from the adrenal medulla as hormones, but they bring about the same action. They're going to help increase that fight or flight response. And as we're going to see when we focus on the heart, that increase in sympathetic nervous activity is going to increase heart rate and it's going to increase stroke volume. There are going to be two different subtypes of adrenergic receptors or sympathetic receptors throughout the body. We have alpha and beta receptors, and those are classified to another level as alpha 1 and alpha 2. Alpha receptors are located throughout the vasculature and are going to bind to both norepinephrine and epinephrine. And what happens is when norepinephrine or epinephrine binds to these alpha receptors, what it's going to lead to is vasoconstriction. And this is very pronounced, especially on the arterial side. And so once norepinephrine binds to those alpha receptors on smooth muscle cells, the radius of our arterioles is going to get smaller. And if you remember from previous lectures, what that is going to lead to is an increase in resistance and an increase in pressure. So that's one of the roles there for the sympathetic nervous system on our cardiovascular system. When it's upregulated, like during physical activity, there's going to be a release of norepinephrine and epinephrine. And for many organs throughout the body, what that's going to lead to is a vasoconstriction of their arterioles. They're going to receive less blood flow, but our pressure is going to increase. Alpha 2 receptors are going to work as feedback regulators in the brain and in certain neurons. Remember that a lot of our actions throughout the body take place in a feedback loop. And so if things start to get too intense, if there's too much sympathetic nervous activity, that increased concentration of norepinephrine and epinephrine can ultimately bind to receptors within our brain that helps slow it down a little bit. Because, a lot of times going too far in a certain direction, sympathetic and parasympathetic, throws off the function of the body. So, there's a lot of leeway, but there is sort of this check system in order to make sure that the body can still function during this environment. There are also beta adrenergic receptors, and these also bind to norepinephrine and epinephrine. Beta 1 receptors, the one we're going to focus on today, are located on the heart. And so when we talk about heart rate, when norepinephrine released by postganglionic sympathetic neurons binds to these beta 1 receptors, that's going to lead to a signaling cascade within that cell, which helps to increase heart rate. So the SA node is going to fire off more frequently. That's what helps to increase the heart rate. Beta 2 receptors are located on blood vessels, which promote vasodilation during intense exercise. For the most part, we, associate sympathetic nervous activity with an increase in vasoconstriction. But again, it depends on where those receptors are and what type of receptors those are. So beta 2 are going to promote vasodilation to the skeletal muscles. And when you think about it, that's sort of a good thing, because the sympathetic nervous system is activated when there's that excitation, that fight or flight response. And if you are going to either fight or flight away from something, you are going to need blood delivered to your skeletal muscles. So even though other organs of the body may be receiving less blood flow, it's going to increase blood flow to those skeletal muscles. Beta 2 receptors are also located within the pathways of our pulmonary system, and what happens is when there's that fight or flight response, think exercise, right? When norepinephrine binds to those receptors, it's going to lead to bronchodilation. Those air pathways are going to open up. If you think about it, that's another good thing. If you're exercising, you want to get more oxygen, more air into the lungs. So by dilating those air pathways, it helps to bring air in, helps to bring oxygen in, and helps really regulate and really help to aid us during those fight or flight situations. So again, today we're going to be focusing on the autonomic nervous system's effects on our heart. We're going to see a few different places where it can have an influence on. One is going to be the SA node. Again, this pacemaker cell. It's going to set the rhythm and frequency of our heartbeat. So both parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons are going to influence heart rate. Oftentimes, drugs that influence heart rate are called chronotropic aids. And so they either influence by lowering the frequency or lowering heart rate, or increase the frequency of heart rate. Another place that can be influenced within the heart is the AV node. And basically, that electrical signal is going to jump from the SA node to the AV node. And this AV node basically influences whether or not that electrical signal is going to be conducted out to the rest of the heart. So the autonomic nervous system can also influence conductivity. And so those drugs and those different things that influence conductivity, those are called dromotropic aids. The autonomic nervous system can also influence stroke volume by influencing myocardial contractility. And so the sympathetic branch of the nervous system is going to release norepinephrine, which can bind to beta 1 receptors located on these cardiac myocytes. And what that's going to do is that's going to help increase the amount of calcium release from those cardiac muscle cells. And as we learned in previous chapters, that helps drive up contractility, which helps drive up pressure, which helps to increase stroke volume of the left ventricle. Now, there's very limited evidence that shows that parasympathetic neurons are going to directly influence these cardiac myocytes and contractility, meaning the release of acetylcholine to cholinergic receptors located on these muscle cells. But it's important to keep in mind that these two branches of the nervous system aren't activated together typically. It's one or the other. And so when the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, like it is at rest, well then that is going to cause a decrease in sympathetic nervous activity, which therefore will decrease stroke volume. So even though the parasympathetic branch is not innervating these cells directly, just the parasympathetic activity does have an influence on stroke volume, but the sympathetic nervous system, when that activity increases, that's going to increase myocardial contractility and increase stroke volume. Remember that the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system is the one that is going to predominate over the sympathetic nervous system to control resting heart rate. And so how do we know that to be the case? Well, we look at scientific experiments. And so in this figure to the left, you could see two drugs that were introduced in order to influence both the parasympathetic nervous activity and the sympathetic nervous activity of the heart. Atropine is a muscarinic receptor blocker, or a parasympathetic antagonist, meaning that it blocks the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so when this drug was introduced to healthy young men, what happened was that their resting heart rate started to climb over the days following the introduction of that atropine. And so that resting heart rate, you could see by the huge increases in that resting heart rate that the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system is the one controlling resting heart rate and really has the bigger influence on resting heart rate. Introducing a beta blocker, which is a sympathetic antagonist, blocks the effects of sympathetic nervous activity, you see, yes, a relatively small decrease. And so basically what's going on here is that just by these changes in resting heart rate, you could see that the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that really controls the rhythm of our resting heart rate. And so typically, or roughly anyway, the control of resting heart rate to around 100 beats per minute, 105 beats per minute is controlled by the parasympathetic branch, meaning that in order to increase that heart rate from resting to roughly 100 or 105 beats per minute, that is due to parasympathetic withdrawal, and that's how you get from resting heart rate to roughly that 100 beats per minute. And then everything above that to maximum relies on an increase in sympathetic nervous activity. The vagus nerve is the nerve that increases parasympathetic nervous activity to the heart. So many times when you hear vagal activity, that's going to be the same exact thing as parasympathetic nervous activity. Or if you hear me say vagus withdrawal, that means the same exact thing as parasympathetic withdrawal, meaning less parasympathetic nervous activity. The vagus nerve is going to have two different branches. The right branch, which is going to innervate the SA node. So that is going to influence the rhythm, the frequency produced by that SA node, and that is what generates the heart rate. And so when there is an increase in vagal activity to the right side, that increases parasympathetic nervous activity. More acetylcholine binds to receptors on that SA node, which lowers the frequency, lowers heart rate. The left branch of the vagus nerve innervates the AV node, and therefore it influences the conductivity throughout the heart. So when the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, like it is at rest, there are going to be increased concentrations of acetylcholine binding to cholinergic receptors on that AV node, and that leads to these hyperpolarization signals, which slows down the conductivity from the SA node to the rest of the cardiac muscle cells. So that influences heart rate and will slow down heart rate, right? So This is not as common and really only happens with certain disorders, but there can be what's called AV block when there is no signal transduction from the AV node to the right ventricle. And this, of course, will cause an issue with conduction and then therefore the contraction of the ventricles and therefore the output of the heart. But to summarize, the vagus nerve is the main parasympathetic nerve, which influences activity at the SA and AV nodes. The right branch innervates the SA node, which influences the frequency of firing, therefore influencing heart rate. And then the left branch influences the AV node, therefore influencing the conductivity, but also the heart rate as well. What we are going to see is that the parasympathetic response is very rapid. So once the parasympathetic nervous activity increases substantially, we see the results of it happen within milliseconds. And so that's depicted to the left here, where you see when there is an increase in vagal stimulation, an increase in parasympathetic nervous activity, heart rate drops significantly. And so, ultimately what causes that rapid decrease in heart rate right away is due to the fact that acetylcholine is going to bind to ion channels, specifically potassium channels, that don't use a second messenger. And so the effects of those moving ions happen very rapidly. And so once that activity increases, you see that dramatic drop in heart rate really quickly. The flip side of that is that when you withdraw parasympathetic nervous activity, those results are very rapid as well. And so what we're going to see is quick increases in heart rate. And so when parasympathetic nervous activity or vagal withdrawal occurs, what's going to happen is there's less acetylcholine being released. And another reason why that then heart rate increases so quickly is because there is a lot of enzymes called cholinesterase. And cholinesterase hydrolyzes acetylcholine. So you get less acetylcholine release, and acetylcholine that is present is going to be broken down by these enzymes. And so what that's going to result in is less acetylcholine binding to less cholinergic receptors on the SA node, and that will then increase the frequency, increase the rhythm of the heart. So what you're going to see again at rest is that the parasympathetic nervous system is the one that is dominant in really controlling the beat by beat rhythm of the heart rate. So all of the, the variability between heartbeats, that is all really dictated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Again, the parasympathetic nervous system really dominates over the sympathetic nervous system at the SA node, and it really has then a huge role in regulating that resting heart rate. And so what we see is that the ability of the sympathetic nervous system to increase heart rate does not occur until there's complete vagal withdrawal. And this is shown in this bottom left figure here, which shows the results from an experiment. And so if we look and we had zero activity coming out of that vagus nerve, that parasympathetic nerve, right? So parasympathetic activity, 0. Now we start to increase sympathetic nervous activity. What occurs is that as you increase sympathetic nervous activity, there's an increase in heart rate, right? But now let's say you have now some parasympathetic activity, right? So this is a lower stimulation of parasympathetic activity. What you are going to see is that once you then start to increase sympathetic nervous activity, there are not big changes in heart rate. That heart rate isn't going to increase to the same degree. And especially so when there's even higher parasympathetic nervous activity. Down below, at this highest amount of parasympathetic nervous activity, increasing sympathetic nervous activity has little effect at all on heart rate. So again, in order for heart rate to increase, first parasympathetic nervous activity has to be withdrawn. And in that 100, low 100 range, then if you want to increase heart rate beyond that, that is regulated by increasing sympathetic nervous activity. And the reason why the parasympathetic nervous system really has dominance over the sympathetic nervous system at the SA node is because once you increase this vagus nerve activity, not only are you getting a release of acetylcholine at the cardiac cell, which helps to increase heart rate, but also that vagus nerve is going to branch off and release acetylcholine, which slows down the release of norepinephrine. So vagus activity will not only directly slow down heart rate, but it will slow down sympathetic nervous activity and the release of norepinephrine, which again, just overall is going to bring down the frequency of our heart rate. So the vagus nerve activity innervates the SA and the AV node to decrease heart rate. The sympathetic neurons, the sympathetic fibers, are going to release norepinephrine at the SA and AV node, which binds to beta 1 receptors, and that's going to increase heart rate, increase the frequency of firing by the SA and AV node. But when we look at differences versus the sympathetic side and versus the parasympathetic side, we noted earlier that the parasympathetic side really doesn't have much influence on myocardial contractility, while the sympathetic nervous system can increase the myocardial contractility. And so that happens on the left side. And when you think about the heart, most of the cardiac muscle mass is located surrounding the left ventricle because, again, this is the chamber that needs to build up enough pressure to eject blood out to the rest of the body. So when sympathetic nervous activity increases and norepinephrine binds to beta 1 receptors located on that cardiac muscle myocytes, there's an increase in calcium release, and therefore there's going to be an increase in contractility and an increase in pressure that's generated in that left ventricle. So the left side affects contractility, but at the same time, you could see that there's no to little influence on the heart rate, on the rhythm of the heartbeat. The right side of the heart, think about where the SA and the AV nodes are, those fibers are going to innervate the SA and the AV node, and when that happens, we'll see an increase in heart rate, and also do have some impact on myocardial contractility, and therefore pressures generated by the heart. Another key difference between the two branches of the autonomic nervous system is that the sympathetic effects on heart rate are much slower than the parasympathetic effects. And so that increase in heart rate is going to rely on a slower G protein coupled receptor second messenger pathway, where when norepinephrine binds to this receptor, the subunits of this G protein are activated, split apart, then adenylyl cyclase is activated, which produces cyclic AMP, and then that eventually leads to a response. So that, will take a few seconds in order for those effects to be seen. Also, the amount of neurotransmitter is much less on the sympathetic side compared to the parasympathetic side. And also, a lot of the norepinephrine that is released is cleared up and taken out by the blood. And so, it takes a while for that norepinephrine to build up and start to bind to receptors and really see those events occur on a bigger scale. And so, when we look at the figure from earlier, we saw that, vagal stimulation, that happened quick. That drop in heart rate occurred almost immediately and stayed sustained. And once that activity was removed, then heart rate returns basically back to normal very, very quickly. But a similar length of time, you see that sympathetic stimulation, we're going from a resting heart rate, and it takes a lot quicker for that heart rate to rise. And then once that sympathetic nervous activity is removed right here at the end of this blue bar, it takes a while for that heart rate to come back down to the resting level. And you may experience this when you work out, right? So when you start working out, your heart rate can accelerate quite quickly, right? Because that parasympathetic withdrawal is happening. So that happens quite quickly. But then, once you stop physical exercise, it takes a minute or two for that heart rate to come back down. And so, beat by beat, the cardiac sympathetic nerves have very little effect on cardiac function within just one phase of that cardiac cycle. Again, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous activity is going to act like a seesaw. The body doesn't accelerate both at the same time, except in like very severe situations. So basically, either the sympathetic nervous activity is going to go up and parasympathetic is going to go down, or vice versa. And so sympathetic nervous activity is going to be suppressed by parasympathetic nervous activity, which suppresses the release of norepinephrine. And so those vagal effects, again, it's important to note that they are much stronger when it comes to regulating heart rate than the sympathetic effects. And so we saw this figure earlier, why that was the case. The limited role that sympathetic nervous activity can really play on heart rate once there is parasympathetic nervous activity. And you see it in another, experiment here where, you increase sympathetic nervous activity. Of course, you're going to get an increase in norepinephrine that's winding up in the bloodstream, right? But once you start to introduce then vagal activity, that amount of norepinephrine release does decrease. And so that's it. Overall, remember that there are two branches of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic side and the sympathetic side. They are going to have their own sets of neurotransmitters and receptors, and what's going to occur is when parasympathetic nervous activity is increased, when that vagal activity increases, there is a drop in heart rate, right? We're affecting those SA and AV nodes, and not as many beats per minute are occurring. While on the sympathetic side, there is an increase in norepinephrine release that binds to beta receptors that can increase heart rate. Remember that the parasympathetic side has little to no effect on myocardial contractility, while the left side of the sympathetic branch will increase myocardial contractility and then therefore increase stroke volume. And last, the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system really dominates when it comes to regulating heart rate. And the increase in heart rate by the sympathetic nervous system really cannot occur until all that parasympathetic nervous activity is withdrawn. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next lecture.